All right, guys. So I wanted to make this video to talk about a movie that's kind of been on my mind the past few weeks since I've watched it on the Criterion channel. And it is not a Criterion movie, but it was put on there for the month of October. And this movie is called Performance by Donald Cammell and Nicholas Roeg. And it is it's a mind trip of a movie, and it's gotten a lot of critical appraisal, well, reappraisal, my bad, for about probably about the past decade. A lot of Brits know about this movie already. It's a cult classic, but in America, it's still kind of unknown a bit. Also, the involvement of Nicholas Roeg as a director also brings up some of the adoration that this film has gotten in the past few years. And I remember watching a long time ago this documentary called The Story of Film. It was made by Mark Cousins, who's a respected film critic. And while while he was making this, I believe one of the episodes brought up Performance and said, if any aspiring filmmaker wants to make a film, this is the movie to watch. And I was thinking to myself, man, and this was, I think, in the middle of the series, mind you. So he brought up all these classics, but this movie with Mick Jagger in it, which at the time I thought, man, a musician in a lead role in a movie has to be bad, right? But I was pretty young at the time. But I kind of look at Performance and how it was depicted in that series as really all these classic movies that you mentioned, and this is the one. And I and looking at it now and watching it, because I bought the copy after I bought the channel. It's like, okay, let me really watch this, while I have time and really focus on it. So, of course, the famous production history is noted. It was whenever it was made by Cammell and Roeg, it was suppressed by Warner Brothers, and they didn't release it for 2 years because they thought the sex, drugs, and violence in the movie was way too much. And you got to remember, this was before Easy Rider. This was before Last Picture Show. All these great American, now we call classics of American cinema. And while, yes, Performance is a British movie, it kind of precursored that sort of questioning that morality of what sex, drugs, and violence really were. And I think that looking at it, it's very interesting to note that this movie came out before those did. And so Warner's, it was before, and this is the same company that had released Clockwork Orange 3 years later in 1971, although albeit different management. So it's looking at this historically, it's very interesting, and I think that's why it's gotten a lot of praise, and because Nick Roeg was involved. However, Don Cammell he was more detrimental, well, not detrimental, but he had more influence on how the film was, how it looked. He worked with the actors. He's the straw that stirred the drink in terms of that and what you see. Apparently, Roeg was the director. Well, he was a technical director, just how things were shot. But in terms of what is this movie about, right? Well, it's about a gangster named Chaz, played by James Fox, who was, I believe it was maybe one of his first film roles. I'm honestly not too for certain. The first time I ever really heard about James Fox was this movie, but he was a mob enforcer. He is a mob enforcer in this movie. And he performs this one, performance being the key word, and he does his job very well for the mafia, but the mafia tells him, you can't turn it off, my guy. You can't turn it off at all. And there's a great scene I'll mention later that highlights this, but anyway. So eventually, one of his personal friends or one of his rivals eventually shows up and tries to teach him a lesson. Well, James Fox ends up killing him without the mafia's authority. So now he's on the run from the mob after defying them, and eventually seeks refuge and overhears that an apartment is being leased out. So he goes into this apartment in this underground London loft, I believe. Well, it's not loft, but it's an apartment, and he's holed up there with these artists, Turner, Ferber, and I forget the character's name, but Michel Berthon plays as. There's two women and one rock star, and eventually all their identities eventually all merge, and everything kind of gets murky from there. So that's pretty much like the main thing about performance is it's really a film of two halves. The first half, and this is getting into spoiler territory, and I don't think you can really avoid it without, about talking about this movie because it's really the whole thing, right? But this, the first half of it is so good whenever it comes to just the gangster element and how it's edited. It's shot super kinetically. There's music going on in the background that's heightening a sense of urgency, a sense of anxiety within the mob dealings, and it's highlighted so well in that first half that a lot of people probably watched that and thought, "Wow, man, I wonder where this movie's going to go," because of how good that first half was. And and the second half is really good as well, but and the film kind of tricks you in that way, where you're going as on this thrill ride, but eventually it just evolves into something completely different. But albeit they kind, and that's another strength of this movie, is that even though it does trick you, it does it in a very intelligent way, because it brings out the sort of beginning of this performance that they tell James Fox, like I said, you can't turn it off. So eventually he goes through and eventually finds another alter ego or some way that he can try to pick up and eventually learn, but has to do some revolting things to get it. The plot is very, very loose, especially near the end. But in terms of the performances themselves, James Fox, Mick Jagger, Anita Pallenberg, Michelle Breton, they do a great job, as well as Harry Flowers, who I believe is the character, right? Yeah, I believe the character in this movie is great. In this Blu-ray, however, his voice is dubbed over. His original Cockney accent is. But I don't think that... I watched the original version and this, and as far as dub performances go, it's not that bad. A lot of film lovers, well, a lot of people that love this film really love his performance and love his Cockney accent. Some people get pissed off over that. I really didn't care. But the performances are done very, very well. And and James Fox does hold it all together as sort of this vessel that we go through to explore, like, what potentially identity is and how we break that down and such, and how we pick stuff up along the way. And in terms of like the production history is as noted that, and the reason why the film looks so radical, even in 1968, is just from the fact that the complete freedom that Don Campbell and Nick Roeg had to make this movie. There was no studio interference when they shot this movie, because they really did think that they had this established rock star in Mick Jagger, that they were just going to make like A Hard Day's Night or something along akin to the Monkees, which I don't know existed back then in 1967, 68. But they thought it was just going to be a fun time. There was already review films, going back to, I believe The Girl Couldn't Help It. And, there was already movies like that existed even before A Hard Day's Night. But anyway, so we go into this, and when Campbell and Roeg realized that, there's no studio interference, because there's a great documentary on Don Campbell on YouTube right now where Roeg was even then in disbelief that they had no studio interference, all this money to create this this crazy work of art. And it does show that these guys literally just made an artistic vision of just almost as complete as you can make it. And so when this movie was released in 1970, and you really can't say, there was probably like a full work print out there that was probably a lot, of course, a lot better maybe than what the film came out to be. But the editing was supervised by Campbell himself, so you really can't say that it wasn't the artist's or director's choice to really release the movie. But anyway, so the movie itself is just nuts, and it's a good nuts. It doesn't devolve into any sort of pretension or anything like that, and that can be arguable, especially in the second half. And which the second half, it does devolve into sort of a breaking down of how it comes to be. The most famous of the second half being the Memo to Turner scene, where Mick Jagger has his hair slicked back, and is acting as one of James Fox's mob associates while he goes into what we can consider James Fox's psyche, and is doing this all within a music video. It's nuts. It really is. It's one of the best parts of the movie, and a really kick-ass song from, and I think it was a Mick Jagger solo performance too, with Ry Cooder on slide guitar, which Ry Cooder rocks, but and so does Mick Jagger in that song. But anyway, it's like one of the best parts of the second half, like I said. So once the second half has been completed, and really the ending is still so the ending itself is like something to really discuss about, because at the end the mob eventually find out where where Chaz is. They come to pick him up, like, hey, you're coming with us, you're getting got. I don't know, we don't know the implication of that, but eventually he goes back into the apartment. He tells Mick Jagger, hey, I'm out of here. And Mick Jagger says, well, let me come with you. And then after that, Chaz decides to kill Turner. We don't know if it's going to be physically but when that happens, there's this really, the bullet goes into the brain, and it's just this really crazy editing technique, or how they worked it, I don't know. But it eventually goes to, okay, they finally got Chaz, and he's getting in the car, but we don't see James Fox's face. We see Mick Jagger's face, or we see Turner's face. And before then, we see that Turner was actually murdered in the apartment. And we don't know if this is figuratively. We don't know if this is just a literal interpretation. I really don't know. So it's just, we now know that Turner and Chaz personalities and performances have been merged into one. So that's the ending of the movie. So I really don't know in terms of where to go from there, or like what type of long-lasting implications that this would give you as a viewer, or what type of long-term, just sort of like a long-term effect that you may have in terms of like what this applies to your identity. But I don't see it as that. I see it as more of like a trip into what the possibilities are of, and they say that, the truth is permitted. Everything that can be influenced on you could potentially be a part of your character, whether or not you may not like it or not, it still may be a part of that. So with performance, it closes out with a really kick-ass song by Randy Newman, I think. So it's just a crazy movie, and I really enjoyed this movie. I don't think it's like a masterpiece or anything. I wouldn't tell like a general audience, hey, come in and watch this movie about sex, drugs, sadomasochism, all that stuff, right? And that is a big part of the movie. It's sort of like an entree, especially the beginning. The beginning scenes are considered pretty rough. They don't get really as rough as the first part of it, I think. Now there is like references to like psychedelic mushrooms, how it expands your mind and such, and to me, it's definitely a movie that if you are kind of sensitive to that, then by all means don't. But and I do think that Donald Cammell deserves all the credit in the world for creating this crazy story. I think it was influenced by Borges, Ficciones, I believe, and I do have that book, and it has wonderful stories in it. I don't know which story in particular it was, but this is a really, really good movie just to take just an experience on, just to see, wow, this was done very, very well. So yeah, some people are going to hate it, but I absolutely love it. Rogue would go on to make he would go on to make the masterpiece and Walkabout, which I still love, and he would go on to make Bad Timing, The Man Who Fell to Earth, Eureka, and Insignificance, and other movies such as that. Donald Cammell, I believe, made 2 features after this, and his career never really panned out as a director because he never really gave airs to a lot of producers and such. So anyway, but in terms of like a forgotten classic, I do think this does fit that mold, and I do highly recommend Performance. It's on the Criterion channel if you do want to check that out, and also on Blu-ray through Warner Archive. And so thank you so much for taking a look at this video. Like, subscribe, comment. Thank you so much.